Thanks, Dave. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to tell you today all about how you can use Firebase and Ionic to build awesome hybrid applications. My name is Sara. You can find me on Twitter at srobtweets. First, I just want to thank the organizers. They did a great job organizing the conference, so let's give them all a round of applause. A lot of hard work goes into organizing these. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you have used Firebase before? Awesome. And how many of you have used Ionic before? Cool. Looks like a little less than half. So first, a little bit about myself. This is a picture I took yesterday at the Salt Lake City airport. For those of you that don't know, they have one of the best Snapchat airport geofilters. It says, "Hey, Mom, I'm at the Salt Lake airport." Thought I'd share it with everyone. I'm a developer advocate on the Firebase team at Google, and we're based in San Francisco, California. This is what I'm going to cover today. So first, I'm going to give a quick intro to Ionic. Then I'm going to talk about what Firebase is, dive into some of our core features, and then I'll tell you how you can use Firebase with Ionic using Angular Fire, which is our Angular module. Then I'm going to do some live coding, and finally I have a special announcement for everybody. Woo! So first, what is Ionic? Ionic is an open source front-end SDK for developing mobile apps with web technologies. So it lets you build awesome iOS and Android apps all using JavaScript, and it's built with Angular under the hood. So how does it work exactly? You can think of Ionic as your app's UI. So it gives you directives that you can use in your HTML that are really well designed. They look great on mobile. They give you things like list view on iOS, nice buttons, cards, lots of different interfaces. So Ionic is your app's UI, and then Angular provides all the front-end logic. So it's built with Angular under the hood. And then it's all built on top of Cordova, and Cordova provides the bridge to your native iOS and Android APIs. That's a short intro to Ionic. Now I want to dive into what Firebase is. So Firebase is essentially a powerful platform for building extraordinary apps. What does this mean exactly? I'm going to dive in a little bit to all of our core features. The first of which is our real-time database. So at its core, Firebase started out as this NoSQL JSON data store. And every piece of data in Firebase is referenced by a URL. And as a result, it returns JSON from a RESTful API. And the really cool thing about Firebase is that whenever data is updated, it sends the updates down to every listening client. So any user that's connected to your application, if the data is stored in Firebase, they'll see all of the data synchronized down to every client in real time. You don't have to refresh the page or pull to refresh on mobile. It's all synchronized right away. So we have native mobile clients for iOS and Android. I'm going to focus today on our JavaScript SDK. So we're all here because we love JavaScript. And so this is how you write data to Firebase using our JavaScript SDK. I know it's a little small. I'm going to do a live demo of it shortly. So I mentioned before that every piece of data in Firebase is referenced by a URL. So the way you create a reference is you say var ref equals new Firebase, and you pass it this URL. So I'm actually going to go to this URL in the browser. Now this is a demo Firebase, so it's a public URL. So anyone can access it if you want to try to mess with the demo. I'm going to make my console really big, presentation mode. And I'm going to create a reference to my Firebase. So I'm going to pass it this URL. And now that I have that reference, to write data to it, I can use our set method. And what set will do is it'll update that location with whatever I pass it, a string, an object, a number, or a Boolean. So I'm going to say ref.set hello. And you can see that it changed there. If I pass it something else, maybe 2 exclamation points, it'll change as well. So that's one way to write data to Firebase, but you'll notice that when I did the second set, it overwrote what was there before. So set is good in certain situations, but sometimes you'll have a lot of people writing to the same node at the same time. You don't want each person's right to overwrite the last one. So for that, we have a method called push. And what push does is it generates a unique ID every time a new piece of data is added to Firebase. So here, if I say push instead, we can see that this unique ID was created based on a timestamp. If I call that again, you'll see that it didn't overwrite what was there before. So that's kind of the basics of writing data to Firebase. Let's go back to the slides. To read data back from Firebase, you just attach an asynchronous callback to your Firebase reference, and then you pass it an event type. In this example, I'm using value. So this will be triggered anytime the value at this Firebase location changes. We get this callback function, which returns a snapshot. Since Firebase is a real-time data stream, this is a snapshot of the contents of your Firebase at that specific point in time. And then in this example, we're just logging it to the console. So I'm going to paste that, go into my dashboard, and you'll see that this object is logged. This is the value of what's in my Firebase database right now. Now if I go in here and change it, I'm going to say, hi, UtahJS, and I scroll down, we can see that it was called again. So anytime I add data or change data, if I go ahead and add another node, we can see that the callback fired again. And I didn't have to write any extra code to make that happen. That's the really cool thing about Firebase, is this listener is always attached to this reference, always listening for changes, and you can do whatever you want when the data changes. So that's the basics of storing and syncing data in Firebase. Next, I want to talk about our authentication. So how many of you have used OAuth before? Most of you. How many of you have enjoyed implementing OAuth? Not as many. So Firebase takes care of OAuth for you. It makes authentication really easy. And you can authenticate users using only client-side code. We have support for a bunch of different authentication providers if you want to authenticate users using email password, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Google, or anonymous auth. It's really easy to set up. The way that you do that, I'll show you. I'm actually going to open a Firebase that I own. So this is not a demo Firebase. And I'm going to refresh the page. Not loading right now. Let's see. I have it open over here. There we go. Okay, so I went over here to my login and auth tab. This is a Firebase I'm going to be using for a demo later on. And to set up authentication, I'm going to use Twitter auth in my demo. So I went over here, I selected Twitter, I enabled it, I pasted in my API key and secret, try not to memorize it. And then that's all I have to do. Now I can start using our authentication methods. And I can use more than one of these if I want. If I wanted to use Facebook and Twitter auth, I could have done that too. I just went over to the Twitter dev tools, created an app, pasted my key and secret in there. And once I do that, that gives me access to all these functions that are native to the Firebase SDK. So now I can say ref.auth with OAuth popup, pass it the name of the provider, which in this case is Twitter, and it'll show that pop-up that says allow Twitter to access my data, and then it'll return an error and a user object if the user authenticates successfully. And this will contain a lot of different data returned from the Twitter API, and then you can use that in your application however you'd like. We also have this method called onAuth, which is a listener that listens anytime a user authenticates, you can do something with the auth data. So that's really useful once you have users already authenticated to your app. Another feature we have is security. So all the security rules that you define in your Firebase are run on our servers. And they're written in a JSON-like syntax. And there's 3 types of rules. There's read rules, write rules, and validate rules. And these map to the structure of the data that you're storing in Firebase. So in this example, my Firebase data is globally read true, which means anyone can read all of the data in my Firebase. And then under my users node, I'm using this $ variable. And that signifies a dynamic path. So this means apply this write rule to any child of /users. And what this rule essentially does is it makes sure that users can't spoof other users. So if you're using Firebase authentication, you automatically get access to this auth variable, and you can then use that in your security rules to do powerful things like, say, only logged in users can edit their own profile data. So this is an example of a basic security rule. And let's take a look at intermittent offline. So more and more users are expecting that your app will continue to work when you're offline. So let's say you've got a chat app on your phone, you're going through a tunnel, users are probably going to expect that the app will continue to work. So they'll be able to send messages, and they'll want to see those messages displayed. And then they'll want them to be saved. When they reconnect, the messages will be sent to the server. So how does Firebase handle intermittent offline situations? So Firebase clients store a local cache of your data. And when the user goes offline, the app will still work locally. So all of your data will be stored locally. And then when they reconnect, all the data will be synced with the Firebase servers. So let's actually see a demo of this. I'm going to use this Firebase that I own. And I'm going to open it in 2 tabs. And I'm going to pull up the console, clear out those warnings. And the first thing I want to do is create a reference to my Firebase. And I'm going to do this on both screens, right and left. OK, cool. Now we have a reference. I'm going to say ref.push on this side, message 1. we can see it updated on both sides. So far, nothing we haven't seen before. I'm going to copy this over here. And on this side, I'm going to say ref.push message 2. So far, nothing too exciting. Someone else is testing. That's cool. So the next thing I'm going to do is we have this method called go offline, which will manually disconnect the client from the server. So I'm going to use that here on the right side. So I'm going to say firebase.goOffline. So now the right side is disconnected, left side is still connected. And now on the right side, I'm going to say ref.push message 3, ref.push message 4. You can see that it updated on the right, even though this client is offline. It didn't update yet on the left because we haven't reconnected yet. And now on the left, I'm going to say ref.push message 5, ref.push message 6. And now what I want to do is reconnect the right side. So I'm going to say firebase.goOnline. And we can see what happened here is the messages were synced in the appropriate order that they were sent. So that's a quick demo of how our offline capabilities work on our JavaScript client. Thanks. Now I'm going to delete this data because I'm going to use this Firebase for something else shortly. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can use Firebase with Ionic. So as I mentioned before, Ionic is an awesome hybrid application framework. And Firebase can be the backend for your Ionic app. They work really well together. So Ionic represents the UI, and then you can store your app's data and authenticate users in Firebase. And the way you do this is through Angular Fire. And this is a module written by the Firebase team. It's open source, and it provides synchronized collections and authentication services. So it handles keeping your Firebase data in sync with your local Angular array. We handle all of that for you. And then it also gives you access to all of the authentication methods that I showed you before. It's really easy to get started. All you need to do is include the dependencies, so Firebase, Angular, and Angular Fire. And then you inject the Angular Fire services into your controller. We have 3 different services, so I'm going to go into a little bit what each of them are. The first is Firebase Array, and this is essentially a synchronized array. Gives you synchronized collections. So this keeps all of your remote Firebase data in sync with your local Angular array. And it has a couple of unique methods that are specific to Firebase Array. For example, instead of using Angular's push, you would want to use Angular Fire's $add, which is going to use Firebase's push method under the hood. So it'll generate those unique IDs for you, keeping all of your data in sync. And you'll see this in my demo shortly. The next one is Firebase Object, which is pretty similar to Firebase Array, except instead of synchronized collections, it's used for storing synchronized key value pairs. So if you've got objects, say like user data that maybe doesn't change too frequently, that's just a simple key value pair, you'll want to use Firebase Object. And then finally we have Firebase Auth, which gives you access to all of our authentication methods. So you can authenticate users with just client-side code. Again, you can use email password, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Google, or anonymous auth. So now let's write some code. We're all here because we love programming. We're going to build a social, local, mobile, real-time chat application. Lots of buzzwords. First, I'm going to open up Sublime. And how is the font size there? Good? OK. Awesome. So what I have here is a basic Ionic CLI application. So Ionic has a really great CLI. You can generate a blank template. And all of this was provided to me by the CLI. All I've edited is the index.html file here. So you'll notice it gave me a bunch of different directories. I'm not going to talk about what all of them are, but all of the code that we'll be writing is going to be within this www directory. And so we have index.html, and then all of our JavaScript will be written in app.js. So what I'm going to do first is start up the Ionic server. They have this Ionic serve command that lets you see your app in the browser. So this is what it looks like right now. Doesn't do anything yet because we haven't written any JavaScript. And it looks pretty wide because it's going to be optimized for mobile. So it's got this sign in with Twitter button and this header. And I'm going to quickly walk through how I set this up in the index.html. So I've only written the UI for the app. Over here in my app.js, all of this was given to me by the Ionic CLI except for this controller. So I added a chat controller. So looking at the index.html, Ionic provides all of these custom directives which make your UI look really great on mobile. So you can see that the header is wrapped in this Ion header bar, And then the body of my app is in this Ion content. And here I have this sign in with Twitter button, which you saw on the screen. And this is going to call an auth with Twitter function when I click on it. But you saw it didn't do anything yet because I haven't written anything in my app.js to do that. So we're going to do that shortly. And then there's some other UI elements which you haven't seen yet. So this sign in with Twitter button is going to be hidden. Once the user authenticates, we're going to create this local signed in user variable, and then it'll hide that, and it'll instead show this signed in as with your Twitter username. And then once we have messages to display, it will sort all of those messages by time. Using ng-repeat, it'll loop through all the messages, and then it'll display your Twitter username along with whatever message you've written. And so that's in the Ion content. And then in the footer, once you've signed in, you'll be able to see this little input box where you can enter a message, click add, and then it calls this add message function, which again, we haven't written yet. So that's all the HTML. So now let's start writing the app. We're going to use Angular Fire here, and I have a quick snippet to include our dependencies. So I've just included the latest version of the Firebase client, 2.3.0, and the latest version of Angular Fire. Next thing I need to do is go into app.js, add Firebase as a dependency, and then I need to inject the Firebase services that I'm going to use, which are Firebase Array and Firebase Auth. So now I'm ready to go. And the first step is to set up my Firebase reference. So I'm going to say var ref equals new Firebase. And I'm going to use that same Firebase I created before, UtahJS. And then now I need to set up my services. So I'm going to say scope.messages equals Firebase Array. And I need to pass Firebase Array a Firebase reference. So I'm going to pass it this ref I just created, .child messages, because I want to store all my messages under a /messages node in Firebase. Next, I'm going to say scope.users, and this is going to be a Firebase auth, and that's going to be ref.childUsers. Okay, so now that we've set up all our services and our references, the next thing we need to do is remember when that button is clicked, it calls an auth with Twitter function. So that's the next step. So I'm going to say scope.auth with Twitter equals function. And now, because I've included Angular Fire, I have access to this method called auth with OAuth redirect, which I need to pass the name of the provider I'm using, which is Twitter. And this is going to return a promise with some auth data. Woo! Shout out for promises. Inside here, we're going to set scope.signedInUser equal to the auth data. And then in case there's an error, we'll just log that error to the console. And then one last thing we need to do in this step is we're going to use that onAuth listener that I showed you before, because we don't want you to have to click that sign in button every time you open the app. It would be better if it just recognized that you were already authenticated and then did something with that data. So I'm going to say scope.users.onAuth, which is going to return some auth data if the user's authenticated. So I'm going to say if there's auth data, we'll set scope.signedInUser equal to the auth data. I'm also just going to log that so that you can all see what that auth data object looks like. Otherwise, we'll set scope.signedInUser equal to null. Okay, so let's save that. The Ionic CLI has a nice live reload. So I'm going to open this up in the browser. I'm going to sign in with Twitter. It's redirecting me back. And boom, I'm signed in. Signed in as sararob tweets, that's my Twitter handle. And this is the object I get back, which has a bunch of data that's being returned from the Twitter API. Data on my Twitter profile, so I'm going to make use of my username. It's got a bunch of other data that you can look into that you can use in your app however you'd like. So now going back to my app, you can also see now that I'm signed in, I have this nice little input field, and I can add a message there, but it doesn't work yet. So back to my app. Let's actually write the add message function, which we defined right here when that button is clicked. So if I go back to app.js, I'm going to say scope.addMessage, and that gets past the message that the user typed. And I just want to add a couple things here. So I'm going to say message.time equals new date.getTime. I'm going to store the timestamp, remember, because here we're using ng-repeat. up here, and we're ordering the messages by the time so that the most recent message is displayed first. Then I'm going to store the UID of the message, which is just equal to scope.signinUser.UID. I'm getting that from that auth data object here. I'm actually going to remove this console.log line now. We're going to use the UID in our security rules, which we'll set up in a moment. And then we want message.name, which is going to be equal to scope.signinUser.twitter.username. So we want to display the person's Twitter username when they add their message. We're going to store all this data in Firebase. And then finally, we want to use $add. Remember we created this scope.messages synchronized array up here? Instead of using push, I'm using Angular Fire's $add, which will take care of keeping my Firebase database in sync with my local Angular array. And then I just want to add the message. And finally, I'm going to just clear out the text input so that you can enter a new message. So let's pull this up. I'm going to open it up right next to my Firebase dashboard. Let's pull it up side by side. Say hello, everyone. And we can see that it was added to Firebase, which is pretty cool. It's got my name, my message, the time it was sent, and then my Twitter UID. So all that data is now being stored in Firebase. If I add another message, you can see it's also added there. And that's using our Firebase push function under the hood. So this is pretty cool. It's almost ready to deploy. The last thing I need to do is add some security rules. So right now it's globally readable and writable by anybody. Anyone can write to the messages node. Anyone can pull down all the data, which I don't necessarily want. So I'm going to add some basic security rules here. And the way I do this is I go into our security tab. We see it says we recommend writing security rules, which we're going to do. So by default, when you create a Firebase app, your rules are globally read and write true. And just to quickly show you how powerful the security rules are, I'm going to set read to false, save the rule, go back to my app. You can see all my messages are gone. It says permission denied, client doesn't have permission to access the desired data. It's not very useful to set globally read false, so I'm going to go in and change that. Oops, that was a different tab. There we go. I'm going to set it back to true so that my messages are there. Awesome. So the next thing we want to do is write a simple rule that applies to our messages node. And we want it to apply to every child of messages. So I'm going to get rid of this write true. And instead I'm going to say messages. And I'm going to use a $ variable because I want this rule to apply to every child of messages. And remember I said before that we have access to this auth variable in our security rules because we're using Firebase authentication. So I just want to check that auth.uid is not equal to null. So make sure that we have a signed in user. And then we also want to check that auth.uid is equal to new data. So new data represents the data that is currently being sent to Firebase, so that one particular message. New data.childuid.val. So remember over here, we stored the UID in Firebase. Oh, size bigger, yes. Thank you. There we go. Nice and big. Okay. So I'll quickly re-explain. So our Firebase data is globally read true. And then under messages, we have this rule that applies to every child of /messages that says you need to be authenticated. And then you can only write to the node for yourself. So you can't spoof another user. So I can only send a message as srob tweets. I don't really want anyone else to send a message as srob tweets. So now if I save my rules, my app is secure with just a little bit of security rule logic. Okay, so now if I go back to my app over here, you can see that I've got a fully functional chat application, authenticates users. I've added about 30 lines of JavaScript, which is pretty awesome. But right now I'm only chatting with myself. That's not very fun. Not really a need for security rules if it's only me. But what I'd like to do is deploy this app so that all of you can join in the chat. So I'm going to do that using Firebase hosting. And what Firebase hosting is it lets you deploy static assets really easily through the command line. We provide an npm module called Firebase-tools. And you can just deploy your app with 2 commands, Firebase init and then Firebase deploy. It's for static content, so all of your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if I pull up my terminal here, and I quit out of this, I'm going to clear it, make it a little bit bigger. I've already installed the Firebase command line tools. Just do an npm install -g Firebase-tools. So now I have access to a couple different commands. One of them is Firebase init. And I only have to run init once. It's going to ask me the name of the Firebase app I'd like to use for hosting. I've got a bunch of Firebase apps, but this one is called UtahJS. So that's ready to go. Now it's asking me the directory in my app that I'd like to deploy. And so this is the directory where your index.html file lives. In this case, it's in www, because that's how Ionic has set it up. So now I'm ready to deploy. And now I can just run the command firebase deploy. And it's grabbing all my files, deploying them to our CDN. And boom, my app is live. So now all of you can go to this URL, utahjs.firebaseapp.com. If I run the command firebase open, it'll open that app for me in the browser. And you can see my messages that I already added. You can all sign in, add messages. Somebody's already in. That was really fast. Nice job. Cool, so that's the demo. Real-time chat application, just a couple lines of code, uses Firebase and Ionic. Now normally it would have been great to publish it to the iOS or Android app stores, but for the purposes of this demo, I just deployed it to the browser. So now I'm going to go back to my slides. And I want to talk a little bit about our documentation. So documentation is really important if you want to learn more about Ionic or Firebase. Ionic has really great docs on their website that walk you through everything you need to know to get started, all of their different directives that they provide. And then we also have a Firebase or an Ionic specific guide on the Firebase docs that you can check out. Walks you through using Ionic with Firebase from start to finish. And if you just want to use the Firebase JavaScript SDK, I recommend heading over to our docs homepage. Just click on web or whichever platform you'd like. We have a really in-depth guide that goes through everything you need to know about how data is structured in Firebase, how you save data, how you sync it back, security rules, user auth. Goes into everything in pretty great detail. So I definitely recommend checking out our docs. We also have an Ionic seed application. So it's on our Firebase GitHub seed-ionic. You can clone it down and get started in minutes. It uses the Ionic CLI, similar to the app I built just now, but it uses our email password authentication. So all you have to do is connect it to your own Firebase app URL, and then you can get started authenticating users, and it uses a basic synchronized array. Great way to get started if you want to learn how Firebase works with Ionic. But wait, there's more. I promised you a special announcement. So yesterday evening, we announced a new feature in Firebase, multi-location updates, which is pretty exciting. You are some of the first people to hear about it. There's more details on our blog, but I wanted to give you a quick intro on how it works. So previously, if you wanted to update 2 different paths in your Firebase database, you needed to do 2 writes to make that happen. And now you can do that all in one write. So this is a code snippet directly from our blog. So what it does here is it creates the Firebase reference. And then in this example, we've got users and posts. And under our user node, we're storing a key to every post that that user has written. And then, of course, under our posts node, we're storing each post with an ID and then all of the data for that post. So how this works is we call .push to create a new post reference, and then we get the key to that post. And then here we have this object with all of the data we want to update. Whereas before you could only update direct children at the same time, so now you can update the top level user and the top level post node at the same time. So you define all the data you want to update, and then you just call ref.update, passing it the new data. This is how it works. We announced a couple new features also that you can check out on our blog. Just go to blog.firebase.com to read about all the new stuff. And that's in version 2.3.0 of the Firebase JavaScript client and 2.4.0 for our mobile clients. There's one more thing. What's a presentation without one more thing? I want to give all of you 3 months of our candle plan for free for UtahJS attendees. Woohoo! So our candle plan is $49 a month, and I've got the code for you right here. Salt Lake Firebase. I don't know why it's telling me it's not a real word, because it's your promo code. So you can enter this when you upgrade your Firebase. It'll give you 3 months free on our candle plan. I'll give everyone a minute to write it down. It's not even in the slides. Salt Lake Firebase, all lowercase, all one word. While everyone gets that, I'll give you all a minute. Cool. And that is all I have. So thank you all for coming.